Hey guys, how you doing today? It's Anthony Gangi. Welcome to another episode of Tier Talk. Guys, we're going to have a great discussion today. We're going to talk about the workings behind the policy. So what it really takes to write operational policies in corrections. This is actually coming from a book I have coming out called Warden's Wisdom. It's going to be out as an ebook probably within a couple of weeks, but eventually it's going to be published. This will partner well with the other books I have on the market, including two new ebooks, guys. Surviving Without a Mentor, and Ranked Before Ready. These books are available for ebooks, will eventually be published later on down the line. And then, as you know, I got my other books on the market, just a great combination of books to help you in your correctional career, including a new one that's my sixth book now, published through Blue 360 Media, and it's like a daily guide for rookie staff. So if you get a chance, please get your hands on this. But basically, today we're going to be discussing what happens for the creation of policy, just some tips. And the tagline, again, this is coming from my book that will be out soon, is good policies just don't look right on paper. They work in practice, earn trust in implementation, and reflect the real needs of the facility. But before we get into that dialogue, Russ, you got a lot of stuff going on right now. So if you don't mind introducing yourself and then let us know what you have going on.
Oh, absolutely. My name is Russ Hamilton. I'm a former and now retired sergeant from California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. Started my career all the way back in 1989 at San Quentin State Prison. Went from there to retiring, coming back again for a little bit. Eventually, I ended up going back to work finally for another government agency where I was a senior juvenile correctional officer. And then I founded Keepers of Chaos. That's Keepers of Chaos with a K, in order to bring mentorship and also, camaraderie, training, content, and things like that to everyone who works in corrections. And that's on Facebook, and you should check that out if you can. In addition to that, I currently work now for a private company, and we do reentry and rehabilitation work for a local probation department and for a local county jail where I'm the case manager. And I think that about sums it up, except to say that I'm often found here on Tier Talk. And I'm also currently working on a book that's going to have a working title, something like Complacency in Corrections, how to mitigate it, and 10 other strategies to keep you alive, and something like that. We don't quite have the whole title yet, but it'll be along those lines.
And we are going to get that published, maybe as an ebook first, and try to get it over to the publisher. Sometimes it's good to get the publisher's name on it, because then it's with the publisher's trust, you can send it out to agencies. So it's I guess not unsolicited. Would that be it?
Yeah, exactly.
All right. So guys, real quick, I'm going to read a couple parts of the passage that me and Russ are going to have a bit of a dialogue on it. So there's dialogue on it. There's 20 nuanced tips, but before we read it, before we get those tips, I just want to read two things real quick. So policy doesn't start with paper, it starts with purpose. So behind every solid correctional policy is a purpose, a reason grounded in safety, clarity, consistency, or operational need. But too often, policies are rushed out in response to optics, pressure, or outside influence. They become reactionary rather than strategic. Correctional administrators must resist the temptation to create policy in haste or in isolation, because a policy that looks good on paper but fails on the floor will do more harm than having no policy at all. And a correctional facility doesn't function on theory, it runs on rhythm. Good policy reflects that rhythm, it supports it, it's informed by it. And Russ, that to me hits home, because when I think of rhythm, I think of workload, I think of culture. And sometimes these policies are developed far removed from the floor and passed down blindly without having a true understanding of how that's going to affect the workload, the culture, just the overall dynamic of that facility. But what's your thoughts on that first part, Russ?
Yeah, I think the important thing to realize is that often these type of, top-down policy and procedure things, they're developed in an echo chamber, and everyone, claps everyone else on the back and says, good job, this is great. That policy or procedure then, meets meets reality and immediately evaporates and proves itself to be, unworkable, untenable, unsafe, all of those really bad adjectives, if you will. Uh, Ideally, what you really want to do is you want to construct policy and procedure from the bottom to the top. And by the bottom, I mean the people that are going to be out there living in the environment that the policy creates. Because if you're not doing that, you're going to be destined to fail. First of all, you're not going to have the buy-in from those people, and second of all, you're not going to have their wisdom and knowledge. From the outset, they may tell you, "Hey, there's no way to make this work," or you know what? Maybe if you're a little bit luckier, they'll be able to tell you it's not very workable now, but we have some inputs that will help you. And that's why it's super important to try and get that lowest level buy-in. And by lowest level, that's not a dig at anyone. That's just there's a place where the rubber meets the road, and the corrections professionals that we mostly call officers are those ones who are right there on that front.
And that's powerful because obviously, if you get shared investment, it's easier to have shared accountability later on down the line. I mean, that's ultimately what we want to do as administrators is we want to hold people accountable, but it's hard to hold people accountable if they're not invested in the process. I see a lot of people try to get buy-in when the policy's already been created. Now you're trying to implement it, when technically buy-in comes before the policy is created, because that's where you can get investment. All right, so real quick, the reality of writing policy behind the scenes. So this is one last part before we get to the tips. Most people never see what goes into policy development. They only see the end product, which is a memo, a protocol, a new rule. But those who have been part of the writing process know just how much work, pressure, and compromise it requires. There's advocacy, legal reviews, negotiations between departments, and operational walkthroughs to account for. So look at the filter of a policy when it's being developed. It has to get filtered through all these areas. You're not just writing what should be done. You're determining what can be done. That's important. That's where you want to understand the rhythm of that facility. Sometimes people forget about that. How it will be done and who will be responsible for doing it. Every sentence matters. Every gap becomes someone's problem down the road. And when policies fail, it's rarely because the words were unclear. It's because the process behind them was flawed. Okay, Russell, before we go through those 20 tips, anything you want to say on that?
Yeah, I think that that is the ideal scenario. I think like the old adage about, watching sausage being made is probably a little bit more closer to the reality that we're often affronted by. Sometimes, there's just this attitude that, hey, we'll just make it work somehow, or we'll just order them to implement it. And this is really going to work without taking under advisement, all the different things that you have to think about. So, I would just say, people, if you're trying to run that top down scenario, it's ultimately not going to get the results that you truly want. And I think we really live in an age right now where everything is so hyper politicized that some of these things are really actually impediments, not just to safety and security, but they're actual impediments toward doing other things that we do want to see structured in there, things like reentry and rehabilitation. And I think a lot of times that we just can't get out of our own way because of what happens with policy and procedure.
And you're 100% correct. And Russ, I'm going to cover part of that because that's in here. Now, so I want to get to the 20 nuanced tips for writing and implementing correctional policy. So we're going to kind of speed through these. There's a lot here, but each one, it works in partnership with the others, obviously, but obviously it's not a catch-all. Policy writing is so complex, but this definitely gives you a little bit of a guidance. So first, the first tip I got is start with an operational why. Don't just write what staff should do. Start by understanding why they need to do it. What operational concerns is this policy solving? What risk is it mitigating? If you can't answer that clearly, this is key, you're writing for appearance, not application. Russ, what's your thoughts on that? Because I think that part is true.
Yeah. It's easy to see too if you frame it within that context because, so many times, we see the political correctness of where the genesis is of these things. And, it's all about appearances and truly it never is about actually doing things that are actionable and good and safe and effective and all of those other good adjectives, as it were. And so, why is really a higher thought process, or it should be at least, because we can come up with a bunch of bullshit, meaningless whys as to the things that we're writing into the things that we're implementing. But what we really want to do is we want to try and pursue effectiveness, safety, and after that, establishing things that just in general work well. But those two things, they're at the very base. Effectiveness and safety. Too often, I think that those just get tossed into the wind, as it were.
Yeah, and I like what you're saying, Russ. These are more the tactical whys, but I do think like there are some people that their why is about safety and security, so it could connect to something that's a bit purposeful. But with that said, you're right. It's not a bullshit purpose. It's something that needs to be done. So you're not out there creating a policy to sell some BS bridge. You're out there creating a policy that has a why that's needed. So for this is a why to understand what needs to be done. And again, that should be translated at the very beginning, because this is something that builds investment. This is, for me, is what would build investment. If I had to have a policy pushed down to me, the first thing I would ask is a why. And it's not a why for resistance. It's a why for understanding. Okay, so how is this supposed to affect what we're doing? Because it has to make sense to me if I'm the one that's got to either implement it or pass it down the line. So number two is, we talked about this, involve the people who will live the policy, And we use the word live for a reason. Live is literally what they're doing every day. They're the ones that are going to be carrying the policy out. So policies fail when the people most affected weren't at the table. Involve custody, involve medical, involve food service, involve mental health, classification, maintenance, etc. Not just for inclusion, but for insight. They'll help you catch blind spots before implementation. Russ, we talked about this, Russ. You got to get investment if you want accountability. And this happens in the creation of the policy. So, I mean, would you agree? I mean, this will also keep people invested in wanting it to succeed.
The real subject matter experts, as I mentioned before, are those people at that point where the rubber meets the road, the correctional officers, and so to a similar extent, of course, your sergeants, your supervisors, your lieutenants, and so forth. But really, the people in the trenches, the officers. They are the subject matter experts. They know what will work. They know what will not work. And they know when they're being handed a shit sandwich. So it's one of those things that, get them involved, get their buy-in, and, seek them out in order to produce the results you want. However, if the results that you want, are, just, fascia, covering the front of a building to make it look good, just optics, just a way to try and, look good for whatever the political zeitgeist of the moment is, then, they're not what you need. And you're probably doing something that is actually antithetical towards good correctional practices. But hey, that's my opinion.
No, it's spot on. And guys, remember, the people that have to live the policy, they're the anchor. They're the people that got to ground that policy. So not having them included. And I know there could be some administration, I'd be like, you know what? If I bring them to the table, all they're going to do is resist. Then, okay, then those are the wrong ones to bring to the table. When I bring people to the table, if they know I have to push a policy, they're going to not just give me problems, they're going to give me solutions. And when the solutions aren't there, then I know, okay, we had a justified effort, not excuses. That's the big thing for me. But trust comes from effort. That's the key. Trust comes from effort. So if I have people at the table that I trust because I know that they'll exhaust all measures to get something done, then they got my ear. And when they give me a concern, it's a justification to me. But if I got people that I'm bringing to the table that give you the same excuse and we're trying to work around it and they go back to the same excuse, that's an excuse to me. And at that point, I don't need you at my table. I don't, because if something's got to get pushed forward, I need people that can help me push it forward. Or if not, I can trust in their efforts. So again, everybody, when it comes to that seat at the table, that seat is earned. It's an earned seat. I want people that have problems with solutions. And again, if they can't produce a solution, it's I know because there really isn't one. So it really is important to have good people at that table. All right. So now the next thing I got, Russ, and this to me is important. Now, guys, in this book I have that's coming out, there's a few areas and passages where we touch on policy and procedure. We touch on the rhythm of the facility. So this number 3 kind of touches on that. Test the policy through the facility's rhythm. So don't assume a new procedure fits seamlessly into an existing shift structure. Walk through it on paper. Where does it conflict with count time? When will staff actually complete the required steps? A policy that disrupts the rhythm of the day will not last long. And this is what me and Russ were talking about earlier in the day, where earlier in the show was when people start pushing policies blindly, or if you're the administrator and you're not really connected to the floor in their day-to-day, you have no idea what you're doing when you're pushing down that policy and how it's going to affect their workload, the dynamic. But Russ, you always have to have respect for the rhythm of the facility. Would you agree with that, Russ?
Well, it's not just the rhythm of the facility, though. It's it's the current processes that carry things through each given shift. And when I say that, I mean there's so many different things that are going on. You have feeding, you have counting, you have medical, you have program, you have education, and the list just goes on and on. Vocation and this, that, and the other thing. And so the instant that you try and add and sometimes subtract some element away from that, it affects everything else. And, that whole thing just ends up, being put into some, kind of spin, and it just wants to auger in the ground, go out of control. And then you're not going to be successful. And then what are you going to have to do? You're going to have to take it back, or you're going to have to adjust all these other things. So then you go and you make all those other new adjustments because that's going to fix everything. And suddenly you find that all of those new adjustments that you made have compounded the problem. And it just becomes this, this escalating, just completely escalating cascade of a chain of events, a chain reaction, if you will. And so it's difficult to take into account all of those things. But the people most equipped to do it, rest assured, are those people where the rubber meets the road.
Yeah, and guys, I could tangent off on this a little bit, but I'm going to hold off because a few of the areas I was going to go into is actually covered in the 20. So be advised, this is actually such an important part of implementing policy is what am I throwing it into? So we're creating all these policies behind the desk, but it's got to get pushed to that floor, like Russ said. So what am I throwing that into? And I think that gets lost. It gets lost when there's pressure from the outside. It gets lost when people want to overcorrect. It gets lost when just in general, you have no understanding of that day to day, and the pressure is just to push a policy. And it's like, okay, but the problem is I really don't know how that policy is landing right now. And we'll get a little more to that. So let's get to the next one because I don't want to jump ahead when we're going to get there anyway. So align policy with departmental missions and the facility vision. And the facility's vision. So every department has its own mission, but all must align with the facility's overall vision. So a good policy honors the priorities of each group while serving the collective purpose. If it elevates one at the expense of another, it will create division. Guys, this is important to me, extremely important to me. Now, granted, there's going to be a part down the line when we talk about priority and support roles, but I just want to mention something here. As management, you cover a lot in regards to the operations of the facility. You are responsible for multiple areas that keep that facility running. You are responsible for that house. So you have to understand what the bigger picture is. You really do. And the bigger picture to me is the vision of that facility. What are we trying to accomplish that's aligned with the agency's needs? Now, granted, each department has their mission, however it is, but it all ultimately leads to the same goal. So you have to be able to connect whatever you're pushing, those policies, those procedures, you have to connect it both to the individualized mission and then ultimately to the vision of the house. And part of that connection is kind of remaining objective and fair. I truly, with this last sentence, if you elevate one at the expense of another, it will create division. As we get later on, I always try to tell people, whether you're the priority role for this policy or support, you're still equally relevant. That's the key. This is not competition between departments. It's not custody versus civilians, custody versus medical. It's not. It's us working together to meet the needs of the house. And the last thing that you want is you don't want policies that are coming from above in isolation, because sometimes you have different departments that have, different directors on up, and they are passing policies down isolated. And now the people on the floor are the ones that have to piece it together. So above, let's say medical, the higher levels of medical are not talking to the higher levels of operations or whatever it is. Now they're not communicating. They start throwing policies down on an individual side, basically isolated. And then what happens here when you're on the floor, there's all these gaps. And now you got the front line who are figuring out these gaps in the middle of emergencies. It just, to me, should be something where all those things should be discussed, so we bring down policies that are united from the get-go, and then we could figure out the kinks together, as opposed to figuring out what our role is when it makes it to the floor because it was developed in isolation. Like, that's the thing, Russ. When you have policies that are developed in isolation, we have to wind up figuring our role out. Are we support? Are we priority? I don't know what my role is in this, because no one reached out to us when they were developing this policy. So instead, you just got people just scrambling for position. What's your thoughts? Would you agree with that, Russ?
I would just say, it comes down to this is, people spend a lot of time, talking about mission, talking about vision, talking about, different competing things, design things more simply, and they will work better. I mean, what is it that we're really truly tasked with? And number one is public safety. Number two is facility and staff safety, and number three is inmate safety. And you know what? If you are harming any one of those three prongs, or if you're needlessly adding extra responsibilities and duties that aren't enhancing any of those things, you really need to review what it is you're actually doing. I know we have this huge push with rehabilitation right now, but in order for rehabilitation to do or accomplish anything, we have to accomplish those three things first and foremost. It's not that difficult, and yet somehow we're trying to make this thing out to be rocket science, and it needn't be.
Yeah, and I love what you're saying, because it literally is not rocket science. And I actually have one of the parts here is write with clarity, not complexity. So we'll get that. That's actually coming up. All right, so the next one I got here is don't copy and paste, customize to your facility. So borrowing from another institution is fine for inspiration, but your population, layout, staffing levels, and resources are unique. Policies must be tailored. What works in one facility could be a complete disaster in another. And that's true. Obviously, policies develop at the highest level, and then they get passed down to each facility, which allows for a better operations, because again, it's tailored for that facility. So with that said, you do get some people that could be lazy in their policy development, and what they'll do is they'll just control copy things from the main push, from the main policy that was developed, or they'll borrow from another facility. And what they do is they just copy and they paste it in. And now you have two different rhythms. One facility operates different than another. And unfortunately, it's not working in your facility because it's your policies modeled off someone else's facility. And I've seen it. I'm sure Russ has seen it, where basically, and sometimes it leaks out. Sometimes you look at a policy and then maybe someone controlled and copied a little bit too much, and you see a different name on that facility. It's like, oh, no wonder why it's not working. I get what they want us to push, but this wasn't the way they're doing it. The procedure wasn't for this facility. This facility operates a bit differently. Would you agree with that, Russ? The copy and paste?
Yeah, I don't know if I don't know if that's quite the way that I would frame it. I would just say that what you really need to be cognizant of is determining, what the small moving parts are of your facility, of your unit, whatever it is, and making sure that what you're developing, is truly indeed, customized for that. I know that people, they just want to, go in there and, start just, blocking, that copy and paste type of mentality, because they've seen, something similar to it, and they got so enamored with it. And then the worst thing of all, in my opinion, is when people just want to put their mark on something, so that their name stays around long after they're gone. And sometimes they're never even around to deal with the fallout. And so that's important, is to make sure that you're able to look at those small moving pieces and understand how they're going to be affected by whatever it is you do. Because, a little bit of grit, a little bit of sand, and at least little tiny working gear, and the next thing you know, your entire machine is falling down around you. And the people that designed that, they're like, well, it's time to split and move on to the next machine.
Yeah, and you know what's funny about that, just from a frontline perspective? A lot of us take pride in the facility we work at. So, like, if you do try to implement something that's to the T from another facility, some people will come back and say, well, we're not that facility. They literally will hold themselves very distinct, and I've seen it. And everybody takes pride in the facility that they work in, which they should. Okay, so I got this one, Russ. We kind of discussed this briefly, but write with clarity, not complexity. The more complicated a policy is, the less likely it will be followed. Use simple, precise language. If a mid-level supervisor can't explain it to their team in under 5 minutes, it's too complex to sustain under pressure. I agree with that, right? Would you agree with that, Russ?
Yeah, there's a beauty in the engineering process of things, and I've been doing a lot of reading on it lately, and taking and making something that really is truly complex more and more simple really helps make it all the more better, all the more efficient, all the more lighter, and all the better to carry on what it was. And just this past week, I was watching the iterations of some of these rocket engines on SpaceX. And they started out, really complex with, all these tubes and dials and everything else. But as they went along, they took more and more of that away and left, and were very eclectic in the way they did it, only taking the best of their thought processes and taking away all the stuff that made things needlessly complex, until they have, one of the most robust rocket engines that there is on the whole planet, ever has been, and maybe ever will be. And I think that we can kind of look at that as, kind of a little bit of an analog for what we're doing in corrections, and understand that if we can simplify things, and if we can make things more efficient, less frictional, and with better outcomes. Why wouldn't we do that? And yet we'll have people that will come in there and just start processes and then walk away from it when it all starts to fall apart. So that just was something that I've been watching the last 2 weeks, reading up on this stuff, and just said, you know what, there's a lesson to be learned there.
Yeah, and you know what, Russ? You know what's funny about this? When I was an officer, even as a sergeant, well, even now actually, as administration, sometimes you review reports, and they're written where you feel that the writer's just looking to impress individuals by their verbiage. It's like you're not writing it for really people to understand it. You're writing it so people could be very impressed with your control of the English language, let's say. So now if you carry that same mentality into writing the policy, I believe there are some people that it may not be so much about the policy being implemented, but rather how they sound on paper and getting the credit for writing a policy that is so well written. And it's like, well, what do you mean by well written? Do you mean it's so simple that it's understood, or do you mean it's so well written because of the grammar and all this stuff I was able to utilize? So I think when you do come up with policies that are very complex, especially when it comes to understanding, I think sometimes people wind up just trying to write it for the vanity. I'm going to write this policy. I'm going to impress people with my skill of the English language. I'm sure, Russ, I'm sure you've seen that.
Well, yeah, one of my favorite sayings used to be, maybe it still is pretty is as pretty does. And, that was just, always a big part of, my early life growing up, because, sometimes, there were just, certain things out there that didn't necessarily look good or have that appearance about them, but boy, they could sure get the job done. Maybe one of these days I'll share one of those stories, but yeah, pretty is as pretty does.
Pretty is as pretty does. And guys, obviously, sadly, a lot of policies also become very complex because people overcorrect when they have the fear of liability or the fear of, getting in trouble. So they cover their own ass. So they make it too complex. They add too many layers. And I think we have that coming down the line as well. All right, now this one's another one that's important to me. Identify the lead and support roles before launching. This matters to me. So every policy has a primary department responsible for execution, but it also requires support roles. Clearly define who leads and who assists. In the absence of that structure, staff will default to their own interpretation. Guys, we work in obviously emergency situations, so it's preservation of life, safety, and security. There's a lot of competing factors. And believe it or not, a lot of that, who's the priority, who's the support, a lot of that is pretty much understood through the working relationships between the departments before even an emergency happens. We understand when it's our role, when it's their role, and when we have to shift priorities into support into priorities. And this isn't figured out in the moment, because when you have competing priorities of that magnitude, preservation of life, safety and security, whatever it is, that's not something you're going to figure out in the moment. That's something that's established behind the scenes. So it's great that when we develop policies that are coming down, that those communications are happening at that table so people understand when to step up and when to step back. And it matters. Like, we develop policies where, and this is where it becomes unique. We always train people or departments, whatever it is. We want people to pick up the ball. We want people to manage the gap, make decisions. But one thing we really don't teach a lot is when they have to give the ball back. That's not always taught. So basically it's, okay, if I'm running the scene at the very beginning, so let's say it's an emergency, whatever it is, and I'm running the scene as custody at the very beginning, maybe at one point I have to give the ball over to, let's say, medical. But for some reason, I don't want to give up that ball. I want to hold on to it. I want control. And that's not how policies and corrections work. There are going to be policies that pass down where you are the primary, or sometimes you're the support. And you have to know behind the scenes when that happens. So then when emergencies kick in, we're not fighting for position. Would you agree to that, Russ?
I think that truly the easy way to look at it is yes, you have to divide up responsibilities, and you have to point to where the resources are going to be. Beyond that, it just has to be where each and every individual, especially at those levels that are on the front line. Once again, where the rubber meets the road, and people, are waiting, to be commanded, to be supervised, to be ordered. It should be clear, what their part is to play. And so, if their part is not clear of what they're supposed to do and how they're supposed to do it, how do you expect the policy to work at all?
Yep. And now this kind of crosses into the next one, Russ. But it's anticipate conflicts between policies. So it's not uncommon for policies to contradict one another. Think about new procedure. I think about how new procedures will interact with existing ones. A new program and schedule may unintentionally conflict with medication distribution. Identify and resolve these before rollout. Now, this is important because when you're at that table, Russ, and you're discussing policy rollout, and you're getting ready to create it, let's say, so actually it's before the rollout, you're getting ready to create it. Some of the things that should automatically be discussed and that should be figured out before it rolls out are the conflicts. So when you have everybody at that table, they know exactly what their department is doing minute by minute. And let me tell you something, guys, in corrections, every minute is scheduled. So every department knows exactly what they're doing minute by minute. Management, you may have an idea of it. You may have some generalized times where you can't do anything at, like the count times, the stuff that are extremely urgent, or extremely not urgent, foundational. Let's just say foundational. But there's also other things that are in between those things that are also foundational for the departments. So we may know the main ones, like the security ones, whatnot, but there's also little things throughout the day. So when you're going to implement a policy blindly, without understanding those key moments in those other departments, you are going to throw it into a world of conflict and competition. Because I will tell you one thing, when you throw down policy and it starts to conflict with other policies, unless those other departments or whoever oversees those other policies have been notified, they are going to fight. They are going to do what they got to do because they're going to lean on their own policies to protect them, because the policy will reinforce their engagement. So what they're going to do is they're going to argue and be very resistant until someone brings them back up to the table and says, guys, we got to figure this out a little bit better, because right now, we're not getting really any way with medical right now, because they are not going to bend on what their policy is. Because remember, guys, these are policies and procedures, and we train our staff at all times to try to defend that policy and procedure. So when you start sending out things that go against another department and that department was not notified, that department is going to stand on that pedestal when it comes to defending that policy, because to them it's foundational. So unless there's been talks behind the scenes to manage that conflict, that's something that is not going to manage well on the floor when there's an emergency and they have to try to figure it out, because at that point, there's going to be a standstill. You're going to have one side trying to move things forward and you have the other side not budging, because they're going to be concerned that what you're making them do is a violation of policy or procedure. Would you agree with that, Russ?
Yeah, that's one of the filters that should be in place for this, is because people are going to know policy and procedure, especially about things that affect their particular little fiefdoms, if you will. And so if that's going to create conflict, they're going to stand on what they know, and they're going to stand on the parts of the policy that are most advantageous to them. So what you have to do is by getting their buy-in and going around and having them look at the policy, even though it seems like it may not have anything to do with them, they should still be brought into the process, especially at the part where all of the disambiguation review takes place. And so that's just a part of it, is being able to resolve things through that disambiguation review to make sure that all policy aligns, meshes, and if there's a problem, to be able to flesh that out with which policy supersedes which.
Yeah, and I want to add one more thing to this. When you have the policies that are in conflict, let's say there is an emergency situation, you kind of have like a back and forth between two departments or whatever, a back and forth between two policies that obviously get translated into whatever departments. Well, here's the funny thing, guys. So policies, I mean, yes, supervisors, whatever it is, sometimes we have to kind of work around certain procedures because situational. Not all procedures fit perfectly to every situation, but when you have people that literally lead by policy and procedure, they also, during that emergency time, they may not feel that they're the decision maker to make that change. So a lot of the times when people may come up as being resistant at this time, it's because they're not the decision maker, and they don't want to get in trouble for violating their policy and their procedure. So again, it's a standstill. All right, so let's get to the next one, Russ. I got this. We kind of discussed this, but translate policy into practice with the help of the frontline staff. So once policy is written, your job isn't done. So again, we have the creation of policy, right? Everybody should be invested, but there's another thing. The next challenge is translation. So now, guys, I just want to mention where the difference is here. So we're involved in the investment. We put all the people that are together at the table to work on creating this policy. So we've done that already, okay? So we did everything correct so far. We have everybody at the table. But now the policy still got to be translated to your mid-level managers. So now mid-level supervisors and experienced staff are your translators. They know how to bridge policy with reality. Engage them to develop post orders, checklists, and briefing points that bring the policy to life. Russ, this to me makes a lot of sense because everybody, you get your people that are involved in the creation of the policy. Obviously, it's not going to be everyone, but your key players that represent certain areas. But now you have to get that policy out there. So you still have another filter. You're going to now translate it to your mid-level managers or work with them to get a translation to your mid-level managers, your supervisors, and your senior staff saying, guys, okay, we talked to everyone. This is the policy we're now pushing out. Now you got to help me get that across to our people on the floor. Would you agree with that, Russ?
Yeah, you just, this is all part of, policy gets put out there and then it has to be implemented. And then while the implementation is taking place, that has to be dealt out and translated into whatever the practice or the procedure is going to be from that point forward. And you have to have, depending on the size of it and depending on what the perceived impact may or may not be, you're going to have a lot of people actually watching things as it unfolds, and you're going to have a way to bring all the hands necessary to handle it, put it into place, translate it, implement it, and actually get it moving and in gear to see if it's going to be something workable or not. Hopefully, you will have done enough thought experiments at that point to be pretty sure about which way it's going to go. But that's a little more perfect of a world than I tend to have encountered.
All right, so that gets us to the next one, which is don't confuse policy with optics. What I got here, Russ, is policies built around image rather than function are dangerous. Staff will begin to log searches they didn't perform or avoid safety protocols to hit metrics. You're not building compliance, you're building deception. That's not policy, that's theater. And Russ, I see that a lot when there's pressure or you get some supervisor that makes a false promise. So now you're pushing policies that are impossible because you're more worried about how you're seen and you're more worried about fulfilling a false promise that you cannot deliver. And now you're putting the pressure on staff to deliver that and not understanding, that when you're trying to build policies on optics, it could truly violate safety and security because if you're forcing staff to meet that optic, they wind up starting to cut corners.
Yeah, but just it's just a matter of you're throwing more and more on their shoulders, and then the optics end up becoming more important than reality. We're used to seeing that kind of thing when hey we know hey the governor's going to come and visit, and suddenly you've got work crews out there painting walls and cleaning things that have never been cleaned before. And what are we doing? We're pandering to the optics and not the reality in which we exist from day to day. So yeah, be mindful of that. What is it that you're actually prioritizing along the way?
Yeah, one of the things that I was always taught is what are you trying to solve with this? Why is this policy being created? And if you really get to the root of it, you'll know if it's optics or not. All right, so the next one I got, Russ, this is important because this is definitely something that you must keep going when you're trying to implement the policies. You want to build in feedback loops post implementation. So the moment a policy goes live, it should also start being tested. Create space for feedback, what's working, what isn't. Encourage staff to report implementation issues early, not after something breaks. And when feedback comes in, don't take it personally, take it seriously. What's your thoughts on that, Russ?
Yeah, that's actually something that should exist, whether or not you build them in or not. If I think that if you're having to design, a feedback system and a feedback loop, you probably need to actually do some other things first and really take a look at how your whole department is running or not running. Feedback loops should already be, foundational. They should already be there. Everyone should already know what they are, and everyone should feel comfortable with using them. It just has to be something that's really organic to what you already have going on, and people should already feel comfortable about coming forward and putting themselves into a position to be able to say, "Hey, this is working. This is not working. These other things are really going to, tear us down." This is one of the reasons why we see recently, especially over the last probably, 10 or 15 years in politics, with all of these measures that are trying to be implemented to protect the so-called whistleblowers out there. Why is it necessary to protect them? How come they don't already have protection and all of those other things? And it's because the system is already completely corrupt through and through without. So, but that's just my take on it. And that's the way that I see it.
Yeah, and guys, what Russ said was key with the trust factor. Remember, guys, we were at this point, you have investment, you have shared accountability. So the feedback should not be anonymous. It should be people that are invested in doing it, that want it to succeed. So you're assuming the feedback should be constructive. The feedback is also a way to continue momentum. I mean, obviously, when you're implementing a new policy, one of the things that you want to do is to develop momentum, because momentum is actually what solves problems or obstacles. A lot of people look to solve problems, develop momentum. So here, when you got trust in the creation of the policy and you have people invested and you have shared accountability at this point, then when they come up to you with a concern, it's about keeping that momentum going and making sure you give what the front line needs, or whoever's got to implement the policy, so they can go ahead and move forward in the direction that we want to get it to. All right, so I also have, don't weaponize staff struggles as evidence of failure. So if staff struggle to implement something, don't immediately assume they're resistant. This may be overwhelmed, under-resourced, or navigating hidden conflicts. If you use their struggle to punish rather than support, they'll stop telling you the truth. Now, something funny about this is when you make false promises, you become very outcome-driven, so effort doesn't matter to you because you already put your name out there. This is about your name. This has nothing to do with the betterment of the facility. This is about your name and whatever political aspirations you got going on, whatever the case may be. It sure as hell ain't about today. It's about tomorrow. So now when you start pushing the optics, you start pushing, the impossibility because you're worried about meeting the false promise that you gave to some legislator. Well, now you are going to start cutting off the people that are trying to do it because now you're being pressured to fulfill something that you really didn't have the power to do. It was more for your front line to be involved in that and letting you know if something can happen. But I've seen this happen a lot, Russ, when people in those higher positions are still shooting for something, so they don't want to they don't want to be seen as failures. So they automatically assume if I can't do this, I'm a failure, when it's not the case. You're going to pass something over for optics, give your staff the impossibility, and now you're going to hold them accountable for a promise that you couldn't fulfill. What's your thoughts on that, Russ?
Yeah, I mean, people, misplace um, a lot of emotional baggage like that. Where they're assuming that, people that are in the midst of a struggle, as it being, that whole idea of failure. I think, people should really take it upon themselves as to, take that success or failure upon themselves and not merely, delegate it downward and just assume that staff have everything they need to get it done. I think that's about all I got for that one.
All right, now this one's a good one. Know the difference between initiative and inappropriate workarounds, because I thought of this one too. I mean, obviously I thought of the 20, but this one came to me. Staff often finds ways to get the job done, but not all workarounds are good. If the shortcut sacrifices safety or violates key protocols, it's not innovation, it's liability. You must determine, are they solving a problem or circumventing accountability? I want to add something to this. So guys, when you're developing a policy and you're trying to implement it, you got to make sure that when you delegate, you're delegating authority within the parameters of what you need to have accomplished within that policy. So you do got to have some level of discretion. And really the discretion is to develop workarounds. But with that said, you got to be very careful, because some people, when they try to do workarounds, they wind up sacrificing what could be safety and security measures because they get so overwhelmed with the need for that outcome. Granted, you got to let people know, hey, I'm pushing down this policy, but if something doesn't work, or the moment you have to sacrifice these things, then come back to me and we'll have to readjust. Because I've seen people that get so invested that they want to produce the outcome because they themselves may be caught up in, the ownership of a win or a loss, that they wind up actually doing workarounds that are not really beneficial. They're not really innovative. And at the end of the day, they wind up, causing a bigger concern. And the problem with this, Russ, one more thing is, when you allow them to do that workaround that sacrifices safety and security at the very beginning, it's going to explode later on, because that's going to be something foundational that everything else is going to build off of. And then when you finally discover that there's a concern, wherever you were heading is in the wrong direction now. So if you discover it later on, everything that you've done from the point of that workaround to where you're at now, once it's discovered, is wasted work. What's your thoughts on that, Russ? Would you agree?
Well, yeah, I would just say that, innovation is really important, and it's something that, we want to see individuals tackle. The problem is that, sometimes we may not remember some of the most basic things that we're really trying to accomplish. It's easy to, try and just look back and think about, okay, so we want more efficiency. Does that mean that we run through every single count as fast as we can to try and get it done? What is it that we might miss by doing that? So not every innovation is going to be, necessarily protecting the safety and security of the things that we've already prioritized, the procedures, the policy that we've already written. So be careful, because it may not be apparent as to why an older policy works better than a newer one. There may be something in there that you've forgotten about over the years.
That's powerful, Russ, because you would like to think that new policies should evolve from the older ones and not totally minimize or negate it. So that's actually a very good point that you mentioned. Are we building off an older policy, or are we totally minimizing it? Because if you start to minimize or negate, then you better go back and look at that policy and truly get an understanding of what you are now letting go of. That's a very good point. I actually think I have that mentioned in another passage too. Track how policy decisions impact morale. So policies are not neutral. They can encourage professionalism or fuel resentment. They can build unity or expose favoritism. If a new procedure causes confusion, division, or burnout, take notice. Every policy is also a message. What is your policy saying? Do you agree with that, Russ?
There's always going to be from some individuals a certain level of resistance. I think that saying that, hey, you're going to track that. My question is how should you be mindful of it, and should you try and do something intentional with regards to mitigating bad impacts on morale? Certainly. But I think again, it's a lot more simple than that, because we can go back almost to the very beginning where we talked about buy-in and investment from people, because if they're bought in and they're invested, chances are that it's not going to negatively impact morale. So I think we're starting to come full circle there.
Yeah, I agree with that. And we kind of did discuss that, understanding your environment, what you're pushing the policy into. And if it does affect morale, then maybe you don't have an understanding of the environment or the dynamic of your facility, the rhythm, if you will. All right, so I got stay away from policies that can't be enforced. Nothing erodes leadership credibility faster than rules everyone knows won't be followed. Don't create policies to check a box. Create policies that staff can actually apply and supervisors can realistically enforce. Otherwise, you normalize non-compliance. What's your thoughts on that, Russ?
Yeah, I think that that's kind of the case. Not just stay away from policies that can't be enforced, but stay away from policies that. Let's see. I'm trying to think. I kind of had a good analog there for a second, but I think it's just there's some things that you can't enforce, and that if you're expected to tackle, all it does is it gums up the machinery. And by gum up the machinery, I just mean it slows down your role. It puts you in a position where you're no longer as proactive as you would like to be, and it just like I say, it just gums up the works, and I think that's about all I've got for that one.
No, Russ, I agree. When you're implementing a new policy, obviously there's going to be some direct oversight. I mean, not to micromanage, but just to show more support. But there are certain things that could be out of your control to enforce, especially like when I tell people, you're implementing a policy in a perfect world, and it doesn't work that way. Like, you wrote this policy as if there's not going to be any concerns, as if there's not going to be any situational factors, like a rowdy inmate, let's say, for an example. So with that said, you have to take into account that there are going to be certain situations that can minimize enforcement. And do we have anything in the policy that allows for that shift? Because people write these policies and think they're implementing them in a perfect world. And now when someone doesn't follow through, they become the concern, when it's like, guys, it wasn't them. It was the situation that your policy didn't cover for, or your policy didn't allow them to adapt to. Sometimes you write policies that are so rigid that they can't adapt to the situation, but yet you're going to hold the person responsible because you have no idea the dynamic of working in a prison. All right, or jail. All right, so now you got prepare for suddenness of change. So policy changes can feel like whiplash to staff. Give them time to adjust. Offer briefings, facts, so frequently asked questions, and opportunities for clarification. Sudden changes without support will always be met with resistance, even if the policy itself is sound. And I'm going to mention something on that and keep this quick too, is fear. Or fear could be a big thing because people will be concerned of what they're losing in the process. But there's something else that I mentioned in one of my passages here that I thought was unique. When you go to implement change, there's two things people worry about. One is the suddenness we talked about, and one is what I'm losing. Now, believe it or not, guys, some people identify with the work they do to the point that when you make a sudden change, they lose a piece of that identity. And it's true. They may identify with the work that they're doing. That's their purpose. That's who they are. And now you make a change that shifts them, that they no longer do that work anymore. Now they're doing this. And maybe they were good at the work before, but you didn't care when you implemented a policy. Now the person goes from being this person to that person. So two things I worry about when change is suddenness and what the person feels that they're losing in the process. And I've learned recently through officers I've spoken with that it's not even the tangible. It's their identity sometimes because they've connected to the work. And now you're shifting them unexpectedly, maybe. What's your thoughts on that, Russ?
Yeah, that just comes right back to preparing them for it. And if you've done the buy-in and the investment, they should already be able to see and understand what those vibrations on the train track and the train coming behind it are all about. And so that just part and parcel.
All right, let me get to the next one. So be honest about limitations. We're almost done, guys. Be honest about limitations. Not every facility has the staff, space, or technology to implement certain policies immediately. Be transparent about limitations. Make interim plans. And don't shame staff for struggling with unrealistic expectations. That's kind of full circle, too. Would you agree with that, Russ? That's you knowing what's going on the floor, what the resources are, and then maybe working the policies around what's available and what staff feel that they can accomplish, especially, obviously dealing with their workload as well. Would you agree to that?
Yeah. When you look at, limitations, there's just, different facilities and different departments, that are going to have their breaking point where they're just going to say, nope, we can't do that. We don't have the resources, ability, whatever it is. I went from working in the largest state correctional department in the United States to one of the smallest facilities in the United States, during my long career. And so, the California Department of Corrections, they had practically everything. They had, especially like in their parole department, they had fugitive apprehension teams, and every one of the institutions I was at, had hostage rescue teams, and snipers and perimeters and all kinds of stuff. And as you go to places that are smaller, they're just not going to have those same things. So you have to know, what the limitations are. And those things are, very apparent and distinct across the country. And I've been lucky enough to see a lot of different ones.
And by the way, guys, when false promises are made from the higher ups or the administrators or wardens, it's usually because they're out of tune of what those limitations are. And that truly does piss off staff, because when you go to implement policies that are not in tune with their resources, they're going to think that you're out of sync, that you're not listening to them, especially if, it's like staffing seems to be a common issue. Now you want to pull policy in there that requires more staffing, and they're already getting mandated. They're going to take that even as a disrespect. Like, how many times we're telling you that we don't have the staffing for ABC and now you're implementing D, so be careful on that, because timing could also affect that. Okay. Three more left. All right. So we got policies shouldn't replace people. They should empower them. Policy is meant to guide behavior, not control it. If your rules strip away all discretion, you remove humanity from decision-making. Staff need room to think, adapt, and respond. Don't micromanage through mandates. I think that's powerful for you, Russ, because you obviously being an officer in some very active facilities, being a supervisor in some very active facilities, if you had a policy that's so rigid that doesn't allow for discretion, the facility would be in chaos. And it's funny because policies are meant to control, but if they're too rigid, you lose control.
Well, I think that's one thing that I was blessed with is that, having, the peace officer, powers to back me up, as it were, and to be kind of, autonomous, having been given enough training and enough resources and all of those things. I think it was easy a lot of times to take a very difficult situation, very dangerous situation, and be able to tame it within the moment. I've heard horror stories. I can't necessarily vouch for how true they are or not about just individuals who are so structured by policy and procedure or law that they become very ineffective. And that's not what we want to do. When we become ineffective, we become dangerous. And I don't mean that we become, dangerous to other people around us. I mean, we become dangerous to ourselves. We become dangerous to the inmates. We become dangerous to the process, and everything, heightens the jeopardy that all of us are in by that lack of effectiveness. And so that's something, I've really kind of dedicated myself to trying to be able to point to and tell people, hey, these are some of the things that we should be doing. And these are some of the failures that we're starting to see on a systemic level across the United States and other places, because people are making policy and procedure based on political correctness rather than good, sound correctional experience.
Now, guys, I want to mention something real quick. I've been in prison management now for over a decade. I started in April of 2015, so I've reached the decade mark. So there's a lot of things that I forgot was a worry for me. So when I was an officer or a sergeant, I do remember now the pressure of having to stay within policy and procedure, because I was afraid I was going to be judged by any deviation, especially if I needed it in the moment. So if I had people that created real rigid policies, I would be afraid to make a left or a right. Now, granted, I've been in leadership now for 10 years. So I have a lot of authority in regards to, changing a procedure in the moment, or as long as myself, I don't violate policy, by the way, because I can't violate policy either. I don't think I can do that, but I could justify a change in procedure if I have to meet a need. So the pressure that you guys have on the front line is extremely demanding. So for people in a leadership position, be mindful that the more you try to micromanage or mandate what should be more of an empowered staff member, you should want to give them discretion. The more they start becoming nervous on the scene in the moment, and the more that they start to freeze up. And now when they freeze up, there's hesitancy, and now they don't get a chance to stabilize the situation. Because even for me, we don't look for perfection, but I do want people to slow things down when they get to a scene. Are you escalating it, or are you slowing things down? And if you don't give them some level of discretion, that hesitancy is going to speed things up. So complexity in corrections, complexity. We don't deal with difficulty. We deal with complexity. All right. So I think I may do a passage on that real quick, because I still got maybe 30 something more, but I'm going to do a passage on that about remembering that, because that's important. The last thing I want to do is facilitate that pressure. All right. So I got two more of us for here. So I got give supervisors the tools to teach it. Supervisors aren't just enforcers. They're teachers. Give them guidance. Document scenario examples and discussion points so they can explain the policy with confidence. Otherwise, interpretation will vary widely by shift. What's your thoughts on that, Russ?
Supervisors are the ones that can help you achieve buy-in. And I think that's, really, truly, maybe the most important point that we've done here. They're the ones, or I would say they should be the ones, that have the words insight, knowledge, and trust from their people to be able to do that. So without the supervisors on board, you're lost.
Well said, Russ. Now I'll get to the next one. I always tell people your mid-level managers are the ones that don't just translate what's needed, but they're also supposed to be the ones that get us the buy-in. So after you have that meeting, how are you going back and keeping staff invested? Because I can't get to them, but you can. So when I feel that they're not creating the buy-in for me, I have a concern with that. So I try to get them invested in the get-go, so we all have shared accountability in the outcome. And that helps me with the buy-in later on. Last one, Policies should grow with the facility. Facilities evolve. Kind of talked about this before, but populations change. Staff turnover shifts culture. What worked 2 years ago may no longer apply. Don't wait for a crisis to review policy. Schedule check-ins. Update based on feedback. Treat policy like a living tool, not a static rule. What's your thoughts?
Yeah, there's something to be said for evolving. There's also something to be said for refinement. And so, whichever one of those apply, I think it's, well and truly an important piece of doing all of that. So, and I would say, with regards to refinement, choose it over evolving when you can, because, before you're ready to evolve, you might have to go through several iterations of that. There's such a thing as, policy 2.0, 2.1, 2.2. And evolving is when you finally hit 3, but refinement is important as well.
Well said, Russ. Now the last part I have here, and we're done. It's our wrap up. So basically, the weight of policy is measured by the people it affects. So behind every page of policy is a floor of staff who must live it. An officer trying to manage their post with limited help, a nurse trying to administer care without conflict, a supervisor trying to explain something they didn't help create. And behind them is a population of inmates who notice inconsistencies, smell contradiction, and exploit confusion. They don't read your policy, but they read how your staff react to it, which means policy isn't just administrative, it's behavioral, cultural, and tactical. And if it's not done right, it becomes the very thing that breaks the unity it was supposed to build. So remember, this is the last thought here before we get to our closing thoughts. Strong policies don't start with documents. They start with dialogue. They aren't built in offices. They're forged in operations. And they don't succeed just because they're signed. They succeed because they're shared, understood, and supported by the people who have to carry them out, or as we said, got to live through the policy. Russ, anything you'd like to say in closing? It's good dialogue.
Yeah, I would just say, if you're one of the people that's up there designing, policy, procedure, whatever, bottom up. It has to be bottom up. Otherwise, you're negatively impacting your facility rather than helping it.
Yes, sir. Now, guys, just for my closing, guys, I thought this would be a good dialogue to have. Again, it's the creation of policy. Me and Russ really haven't discussed that before. Maybe in the near future, I would like to do another topic with Russ real quick about how we got to create a culture that welcomes our rookies. It's in one of my passages here, but I think it's very important. But as always, guys, the show is Tear Talk. If you haven't, please subscribe, interact, engage, comment, hit that bell. Bell's going to notify you every time I post a video. Stay safe.